I'm from Saratoga, Wyoming, and I grew up in the great outdoors, so that was a very nice place to grow up, especially if you like to hunt and fish and spend time on the river and running around the mountains. So I graduated from Platte Valley High School, 1965, and went following graduation to the University of Wyoming. And I spent 2 years at the University of Wyoming. And after my sophomore year, a couple of things happened. I decided I was going to switch majors, and I also ran out of money for college funds. So I went to the Air Force recruiter and told him that I'm very much interested in flying. I'd flown a little bit before I even went to college. I had a friend that had a plane, and so I got to fly quite a bit. But always had a desire to fly, so I signed up for the Air Force. And the agreement with the recruiter was I would finish my college through ROTC, and then from there I would go into active duty, and hopefully I could get into a pilot training program. But if I graduated from ROTC, then I'd have my commission as a second lieutenant. So it was a really good plan. The only issue was I had to wait 3 months to get into the Air Force. They had only so many slots available, so I had to wait 3 months to officially get in, and then to re-enroll at the University of Wyoming. Well, that was during the Vietnam era, and the moment I dropped out of college, Uncle Sam's Army sent me a letter, certified mail. We need you to go into your induction station, and we need to have a little talk with you. And of course they wanted to talk about why I was no longer in college and what my plans were, and I told them. And within a week's time I received an induction notice into the Army. So all of my plans, my best laid plan for going to the Air Force and hopefully becoming a pilot, went down the drain with that. I tried to argue the issue a little bit, but that didn't work so well. So I did end up getting drafted into the Army. And I went through basic training, AIT, and went through combat engineering and became a demolitions expert. So I progressed fairly well and did fairly well, and progressed to sergeant, a buck sergeant E5, I believe. And at the same time, I had gotten notice that I'd qualified for officer candidate school. So I had to take a look at, did I want to stay in the Army longer than I had planned for just the induction period or not. And I chose to go ahead and go to OCS. And the reason I did was I learned more about the Army than I had known previously, and I found out that if I went through OCS and got my commission, I could also possibly fly in the Army. So with that, I thought going to officer candidate school was a good idea. And I ended up going to Signal Officer Candidate School, Fort Gordon, Georgia, and very rigorous training, but I did get my commission. So graduated from OCS, and following OCS I qualified for helicopter school and also for a career officer course. So I actually went through training in both areas. For Bailey, come sit. Bailey, he's okay. But anyway, I finished the officer career course and then went through Rotary Flight School. As soon as I was certified in Rotary, I received my orders to go to Vietnam. I ended up with a dual MOS because through my career officer training, I studied in the field of combat communications. So I was working on combat communications and also working on my Rotary certification. Immediately got orders to Vietnam, and flew over to Vietnam with a plane load of young second lieutenants in the Army, and arrived at Ton Son Air Base, and did not have orders for any particular unit. And I remember when I went through the assignment station there outside of Saigon, I kept trying to get into an aviation unit, and I kept saying I want to go to an aviation unit. Well, as it turned out, and at the time I could say unfortunately, but everything worked out okay. The battalion combat communications officer, first lieutenant for the Black Lions of the 1st Infantry Division, had just been killed in combat. They looked at my MOS, not in the aviation area, but rather in the communications area, and said, we really need you to go up there. And hopefully once you get an assignment, you may be able to do some flying as well as combine that with your communications duties. So that is essentially what I did through my tour of duty. I was assigned to the Black Lions of the 1st Infantry. At that time, I was a 2nd lieutenant, but I made 1st lieutenant while I was in Vietnam. Was only in country less than a week and received my first wound. We had a 122 millimeter rocket explode overhead at our base camp. I was wounded in the leg. One of the other young officers that was with me lost an arm and a leg, and the third one was killed. And then following that, almost all of my service in Vietnam was on missions into, triple canopy jungle and various areas along the Cambodian border. So we would fly in. I was always with the first sortie going in. We would fly in, drop off some infantry troops and also my communications company, and we would set up communications. So we would have ground communications, and then ground-to-air communications, and then hopefully communications back to air support and artillery support. So my job was always to make sure everyone was in communication, and that required that I be right there with the initial insertion force to ensure that that would happen. So we just went on many different missions along the Cambodian border with the Black Lions of the 1st Infantry. And it was a difficult time. We lost a lot of troops. One of the operations I was on was we normally went in as a battalion light, and one of the operations I went in on, we were in for about 2 weeks, and then we were finally overrun totally by the NVA. Our role essentially as the Black Lions: go in, make contact with the enemy, withdraw to some nature, call in airstrikes or artillery if they were within range, and then try not to engage in the actual combat. Unfortunately, there was never a time we didn't engage in combat, because in the jungle you're just almost face to face anytime you make contact with the enemy. So we lost a lot of men, but one particular operation, Fire Support Base Julie, we were a battalion light, and after we were totally overrun by the NVA there, of the battalion light, there were only 20 who weren't either killed or injured in that particular operation. Another time I was on a mission, and we were actually flying just in a support operation, and we got a radio call that there was an infantry unit on the ground that had been overrun. They'd gone into a horseshoe ambush. And so we went down to see if we could do anything to help. And we were just in a slick Huey at that time, so 2 door gunners, but it wasn't a gunship. So we didn't have any forward firepower or anything like that. We did get down on the ground. We took on a couple of wounded and just started lifting off, and the enemy came right out of the forest, and my helicopter took a direct hit from an RPG. And I was jumped out the right door to try to help load couple of the troops in. And I was just starting, I just had my foot on the rudder. I was climbing back in the right seat, and we took the direct hit about treetop level. I didn't even get back into my seat, and was blown out of the helicopter. And I was the only one that lived through that. So I suffered neck injury and some back injury from that, but essentially came out of that unscathed, and 7 others lost their life in that. So that was one of the worst memories I have of combat. Went on several other missions. Spent some time in a medical facility after that, and then went on other missions. We continued to do what we were trained to do and what we were sent to do. 11 months into my tour of duty, we were out on another night defensive position, and once again totally overrun in a ground attack. They estimated over 2,000 NVA overran our position, and in that particular battle, I was wounded severely. I was shot twice in the right arm and right shoulder, once in the chest, and then several shrapnel wounds. And it was foggy, it was rainy, it was during the monsoon, and they couldn't get any medevac choppers in. So I had a tourniquet on my right arm for 12 hours, trying to stop the blood, and I continued the communications, and also there was quite a bit of what we refer to as hand-to-hand combat going on. So there was a lot of firepower going on within our position, coming in from outside our position, but we couldn't get air support, we couldn't get artillery support, and that went on for 12 hours. Finally, the fog cleared. We called in some gunships, had some Cobras come in, and then we had some Air Force fighters come in. And they basically saved our bacon, if you will. But after 12 hours, we finally got medevac choppers in, and we medevaced the wounded and the killed in action. And then I was medevac then too. So that was 11 months.
With the tourniquet.
Yeah. And what happened was I had lost so much blood, we thought we had it stopped. A medic had helped me put the tourniquet on right at the top of my arm. And I was bleeding profusely because I was shot twice through the upper portion of my arm and my shoulder. And we thought we had the bleeding stopped, but I was just saturated in blood, and I didn't have a lot of time to try to figure that out. I just thought it was from that initial, the initial injuries. As it really turned out, I had a sucking chest wound and didn't realize it. So as I remember, as the medevac choppers came in and they came to get me to load me up, the last thing I remember was lying down on the helicopter. And the next time I woke up was 7 days later, and I was in Yokohama, Japan. So they stabilized me at Long Binh, Vietnam for a couple of days, and then they shipped me to Japan. But I was essentially, I guess, unconscious, or at least was not cognitive of what was going on. I'd lost so much blood. But when I recovered in Japan, the next day they were going to amputate my right arm. Gangrene had set in. I had a tremendous contusion on my arm, and an Army nurse started working with me, and I got a little bit of tingle in my fingers, started working with a little nutty putty ball, and within 2 or 3 days I had enough movement in my fingers that the surgeons were just giving me a day at a time. And today I have 70% disability in my right arm and shoulder, but very fortunate and very blessed, because you know the surgeons made decisions to save your life if they could, and that's one reason they were going to amputate it, is because gangrene was severe enough that we couldn't let that go on. But once I started getting a little bit of movement, and I found out that I might be able to save my arm, you get very, very motivated to do whatever you can. And I was just blessed with the fact that I was able, by working with the medical staff, and this one Army nurse in particular I remember, that really helped me turn the corner on that. So I came out pretty good. Yeah, I came out pretty good. I left there and I went to Fitzsimmons They tried to send you to a hospital closest to your home, and since I was a Wyoming guy, they sent me to Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in Denver. And I was in and out of Fitzsimmons for almost a year, between just recovery, physical therapy, and then I started having a few bouts with nightmares and things like that. And of course, that later on got to be an issue in life. I ended up with the physical disability. After I finally left Fitzsimmons, I did take over a communications company in Fort Lewis, Washington, and I stayed in for about another 6 months running that company, but they finally told me that I couldn't pass a military flight physical, had severe hearing loss, and I also had the permanent disability in my right hand, right arm, and shoulder, and I couldn't be a pilot with that impairment, if you will. So when I found out that I couldn't pursue my dreams of being a pilot, then I decided to get out. And so I got out, went back to the University of Wyoming, and eventually got my bachelor's, and then over time I got my MBA.
Your bachelor's in?
My bachelor's in economics, business. I switched majors a few times. Still wasn't. I was in aeronautical engineering for a little while, and then I switched into economics, and I actually got a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, and then later an MBA in Colorado, the University of Colorado and Regis University. I went to a lot of different schools to get through all of it, but it all worked out over time. So.
Okay. Tell us about the book you brought with you.
Yeah. And I'll give you a little background on the book as well. It's called Tears of a Warrior, a family story of combat and living with PTSD. In the mid-1990s, I had continued to have nightmares and a lot of anxiety, and I knew, that it was really about my war experience, but a lot of the medical professionals didn't understand PTSD, and it's like, must be work stress. I had a career in management with AT&T, and it must be work stress, but I knew that it was not that. In the mid-90s, the University of Colorado Medical Center did a 2-year study on combat PTSD. And I read about it in the paper, and I called them, and I gave them my background, and they invited me down for an interview, and I was accepted into the 2-year study. So the good thing about the study was conducted by doctors and nurses, all of whom had served in Vietnam. So finally had a support group that really understood the phenomenon of what we were going through, whether you want to call it combat fatigue or shell shock or soldier's heart, and of course now we call it post-traumatic stress. Mm-hmm. So I went through that, a 2-year study, and I did that while I was still working my career, did it after work, sometimes on the weekends. Combination of counseling, meditation, different relaxation techniques, and medication as appropriate. And some of the medication were blind studies, so we had placebo at times and things like that. But that 2 years turned my life around. And the reason that it turned my life around was I thought for the longest time, being a tough Wyoming guy, that I could beat this thing that was waking me up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat and the panic attacks, and I just thought I could beat it because I know I'm tougher than this. And the more I resisted and the more I tried to fight it, the worse it got. And I immersed myself in my career for almost 30 years, but it would come out at home. And my wife would see it, my kids would see it. And after that study, what I learned was I probably will have this for the rest of my life. But once I learned that, I didn't have false hope any longer that I'll wake up someday and it'll be gone. Once I learned that the feelings are there, the experiences are real, but there are ways you can manage through it, I started moving down to the road, down the road of recovery. So after that study, my wife and I started talking about my experience for the first time. And we talked to our children. We have 2 sons, and we talked to them a little bit. And we started just kind of jotting down some notes. And it was difficult for me, but it was the way to share with my family my combat experience, because I'd never talked about it before. And so I started writing things down. My wife started taking notes. And my wife, by the way, has a PhD in neuroscience, so she really understood a lot of what was going on. And so she's been a wife, a mother, a caregiver, and a professional all in one. But we started putting together a manuscript for our family. And that manuscript started growing, and some veteran friends read it, and they said this is a bigger story. And as it turned out, we were encouraged to put that into a book form. So when we talk about Tears of a Warrior, that's how it all came about. It started in just telling our story, our family story, that I've just explained here, to just our family, and then it grew from there. And today we have about 400,000 copies in circulation. It's being used by VA hospitals around the country. It's being used in vet centers, veteran organizations. Quite a few are getting the book, and some military organizations are getting the book. We've literally donated thousands of books because we wrote it to give back and make a difference. So that's why we wrote it, and a lot of those books that are out there have been donated by us.
So you're helping our current warriors.
Yes, absolutely. We've just been so blessed with this experience, because some have said, has it been cathartic? I don't know if it has or not, because I was on the road to healing because of the study experience prior to the book. But I think the more I've talked about it, we've been asked to go around the country and talk to various groups about our experience, because it's also their experience. And the book is written from that perspective. I mean, we were soldiers, we served, we did what we were asked to do back then, and families endured so much of that, and families were there with you, and they supported you throughout this. So it's a portion of the book is my combat story to kind of set the groundwork, but more importantly, it's life after combat, and healing from the physical and the emotional wounds of war. And so that's what we really talk about, is healing mind, body, and spirit. And that's the basis for the book, and that's why we wrote it. So.
And this beautiful animal?
This beautiful animal, this is Hunter Bailey of Fargo, and he's a wonderful dog. About 15 years ago, I've always had lab retrievers, and I started training some of my labs as service dogs. And we started working more and more with veterans, and so we've gotten more into it. But he actually is my service dog. He's a PTSD service dog, and you might call him a comfort dog or what have you. But he can lie by my bed, and if I start making noises or sounds like I'm having what I would consider a nightmare or what have you, he'll put his paws up on me, up on my chest. He stays real close to me. Part of my therapy is I spend a lot of time in the outdoors, and I spend a lot of time by myself, but I'm never alone, because my service dog is always with me. And my family likes to be in the outdoors with me, but they can't always be there. My wife's a professor right now at Colorado State University, so she's working, and we're both supposed to be retired, but she's not right now. So I spend a lot of time out hiking and fly fishing and river rafting. He's always with me. And I'll get back and I'll start telling stories about what a great time we had. And we start thinking about who we are, like your buddies or what have you. But in my case, my buddies quite often are my service dogs. So Hunter Bailey, we call him Bay. He's wonderful. And I'm not sure how well I'd do without him. We call him the Velcro dog. He just kind of sticks to you.
Okay.
But no, a wonderful company, and just a pleasure to be with. Unconditional love.
Tell me about this weekend. What does this reunion do for you?
It's, I have never, even though I know what we went through with American society and the American public in general when we returned, I think one of the blessings of being a Wyomingite is a very patriotic state. my family was very patriotic. My dad, my uncles all served in the military, so I had quite a bit of support. When I went back to college, I saw the protest side and all of that. But to answer your question, what does this mean to me? I believe that I have, for some time, felt, at least within my circles, respected for serving my country. There have been individuals that I've had confrontation with, like most of us have, but you just work through those things. And I think it's really important in general for the Vietnam veterans to have an official welcome home. I haven't talked to too many here, however, that have felt that this was the first time they felt that they were welcome home. I think a lot of us, for a long time, have been working through those issues. Okay, there's been a lot of emotion with Vietnam veterans, and I'm speaking from my experience because all service members may have issues, but as Vietnam veterans, we've worked through a lot of emotions over a lot of years, and I think that most of the veterans that I've spoken with here and those that have stopped by and talked to me, and many of them, by the way, have read our book. We're here and we're taking some donations for the book to autograph them, and people will come up and say, "I've already read it. I'll take another one," or "I want an autograph copy." But anyway, this has been, I think, a good experience. It's nice to see the Wyoming community come out, and it's nice to see, the governor here and the Veterans Commission behind all of this, and the community in general. And I think that means a lot to all of us. It really does truly mean a lot. And I think it's just another step towards the healing process, if you will, because even if not all Vietnam veterans served in combat, not all of them saw combat, but they still have a lot of feelings and a lot of emotions around the fact that they did serve, and the fact that they came home to something less than a nice welcome. So a lot of that has stayed with a lot of Vietnam veterans for a long time. So I think this is a wonderful activity to help that healing process.